The Majority Report with Sam Seder.
It is Friday, April 6, 2018. My name is Sam Seder. This is the 5-time award-winning Majority Report. We are broadcasting live to tape steps from the industrially ravaged Gowanus Canal in the heartland of America, downtown Brooklyn, USA. Yes, it's Casual Friday, folks, but guess what? We're so casual, we're on vacation. But guess what again? It's not going to be casual because of it. This is actually one of those situations where we are so casual that we go around the casual atmosphere, around the planet of casualness, and land at the least casual point that one can get from casualness.
The horseshoe theory of casualness.
That's exactly right. Now, if you aren't totally exhausted from trying to figure that out, today on the program, Julie Ann Wilson. She is an associate professor at Allegheny College, professor of media and cultural studies, specifically journalism and communication and media. And she's written a textbook, Neoliberalism, looking at the cultural implications of neoliberalism. It's fascinating. You know, sometimes you enter into a conversation and you're like, I'm not sure if this is going to work. You know, it's a textbook, and but very interesting. She teaches college students, and this book came out of her interactions with her college students. It's a fascinating book. It's one, I got to be honest with you, I don't know if I said this to her. Did we cut out the part? I mean, I told her I'm going to get this book from my 12-year-old daughter, and she's not going to understand most of it. And she probably won't let me read much to her. What I'll probably do is just like read it to her, just like stand outside her door of her room and just read it out loud and hope that she gets a little bit by osmosis, and that by the time she's like 17, she's garnered more of it, because so much of a young teen or a tween and a teen's life these days is subconsciously prepping them for a market. Where, like, look, we were all that age, and, you know, when you're going through particularly adolescence, you're trying to establish who you are and what's important to you and how you want to project yourself to the rest of the world. And now, like, those impulses are magnified and juiced in a way that I don't think we can fully understand, because it's so much about personal branding and your Instagram account and how many likes you've got. And it's inescapable. It's different than, in some ways it's very similar to, you know, the idea of like, oh, I'm a tween in, you know, the early 70s or mid 70s, and my sister's on the phone all the time, that type of thing. But it's more. And there is a lot of data suggesting that teens, tweens, college students are carrying around a lot more stress than we did. I mean, it's weird because on some level, teen pregnancies are down. Teen substance abuse is down. But their interactions with other people are also down. Interactions in real life. And the stress that they feel, because in some ways they're in a rat race at a much younger age than I think any generation before them. And so anyways, that was a long way of me saying, like, I'm going to buy this book for my daughter. I guess, you know, Casual Friday. Might as well talk about
Textbook about neoliberalism.
Yeah, exactly. That's what she wanted for her birthday. Can you imagine if there was a kid who was like, what do you want for your birthday? A textbook on neoliberalism. I think I would probably, don't say anything to my kids, but if I was aware of a kid that age who wanted
You'd probably give them an internship on this show over your own children.
I'm not even convinced I wouldn't adopt them and just sort of boot my kids out. I don't know. Let's look, that's not going to happen, so there's no point in speculating. Folks, just a reminder, speaking of personal branding and the rat race, you can support this program by going to jointhemajority.report.com. And when you do, you support this program. You make it possible to exist every single gosh darn day. And what do you get in return? Well, members know they've been getting Matt Deep Archive picks all week. What? Your minds are blown by those interviews? Yeah, I know. That's what Matt does. He's a professional mind blower. All the other stuff he had to learn. But when I hired him, I basically just said, I'm going to hire the first mind blower who walks through the door.
They teach that in gym class in North Dakota.
There you go. That's why. Mostly, that's if it wasn't for that, most people from North Dakota wouldn't be able to ever get a job. So you get the fun half. You get the fun half, which during, when we're not on vacation, is just simply fun. And when we are on vacation, is intriguing. The extra amount of intrigue. So go to jointhemajorityreport.com, become a member. If you don't have the finances, but you do want the fun half, send us an email at majorityreporters@gmail.com. One of the things our members do is not only support the show, but also make it possible for other people to become members too. So thank you to our members. All right, enjoy this, I should say. We will be back Monday live. I will be here sitting in this very chair that I'm sitting in now, just like I do on just about every other Monday. Just day in, day out. We're here. So sit back, enjoy this interview with Julie Wilson as much as I enjoy doing it on the on her textbook, Neoliberalism. And we will be back Monday. If you remember, stick around for the Deep Archive hit, Matt pick. All right, back in a sec. We are back. Sam Seder on the Majority Report on the phone. It's a pleasure to welcome to the program Julie Ann Wilson. She's an associate professor at Allegheny College, Department of Communication, Arts and Theater, author of, with Emily Yochim, Mothering Through Precarity, Women's Work in Digital Media, and also of the book Neoliberalism. Julie, welcome to the program.
Thanks for having me, Sam.
So, okay, we have had many guests over the years to talk about neoliberalism. We hear it in the vernacular used quite a bit. Give us a nutshell definition from your perspective as to what neoliberalism is, and maybe perhaps how it's misused to the extent that it is in, I guess, colloquial usage, particularly online.
Okay, so I really was involved in a lot of debates on the left in terms of to what extent is neoliberalism a useful term. Some people will say, why call it neoliberalism? It's just capitalism and liberalism, perhaps on steroids. Why confuse it? But confuse things by talking about something new. But in the book, I really try to present neoliberalism as a kind of shift in the kind of logics of governance and capitalism that's happened over the course of the 21st century and into the 21st century. But basically the idea is that with liberalism, it was rooted in liberalism, liberal social thought was rooted in the idea that you have a state and a public sector and a private market. And generally speaking, it was a kind of laissez-faire type thing. The state should stay out of the market as much as possible, but the state was also there to guarantee kind of the rights of individuals, especially property rights. So what happens in neoliberalism, though, is that you kind of get rid of this line or this idea that there should be a separate public and private, and everything should become marketized. And what that means for people, then, is that they are not citizens with kind of rights and property to protect, but simply capital that should be appreciated. And so in the book, what I'm trying to do is, people talk about neoliberals all the time in academia, especially, but I really was trying to kind of think about the ways that neoliberalism has seeped into our kind of culture and our everyday lives in really powerful ways that make it hard to organize and imagine a kind of world beyond capitalism.
Now,
so yeah,
and I should just say, for the sake of clarity, when you're saying liberalism, you're talking about classic liberal, I guess, a thought, right? I mean, we're not talking about the sort of the more colloquial use of a liberal today.
Exactly. So yes, when I talk about neoliberalism, I'm talking about, and liberalism, we're talking about classical economic free market philosophies, of Adam Smith up through Hayek, who are the neoliberal thinkers. The first thing I tell my students, which is who this book was written for, was that we are so confused about what we think liberal means, and that we have to throw out that kind of colloquial sense that, liberal is the kind of left side of the political spectrum. I said, well, we're all pretty much liberals in some way or another, in the sense that we live in a capitalist free market system.
Right, and my understanding of neoliberalism, as it's traced through sort of Hayek and the Mont Pelerin group, was this notion that a free market, but we should also we should have enough power within the state to sort of tilt that market in a certain way. Right? I mean, is that how? I mean, give me your sense of that perspective.
Yeah, so I look at it as neoliberalism actually wants a very aggressive state, but it's not a state that's doing things like taking care of citizens or providing a social safety net. It's a state that's aggressively promoting and protecting private markets and kind of free enterprise, and without a lot of concern for monopolies or kind of power imbalances or anything like that. So, for example, with my students, which kind of, and this goes to the point about the colloquial ways we think about liberal in our political discourse, like the Affordable Care Act was a very neoliberal policy to the extent that it's the government forcing people into a private healthcare market, right? And so you have a state that is doing things and is not laissez-faire, but is actually mandating people to participate in a kind of private market system of healthcare. And that's just one example of the kind of more left forms of neoliberalism versus the more right forms, which tend to think that the state shouldn't do anything except help rich people get richer.
Right, and so an example of sort of a conservative form of neoliberalism would be one which, I guess, a so-called right-to-work legislation, right?
Exactly.
Or ones that inhibit the power of labor, let's say, over capital. Or right. Promote the power of capital. All right, and I think that's important because there is so much confusion out there about these terms. I'm curious as to, just an aside from the moment, how many of your students, like when they come in and they hear these things, like where are they situated when they hear this? Like how much understanding do they have of these terms that I imagine those who are attracted to take your course in the first place have had some interaction with those terms?
Yeah, so the reason I wrote the book and started teaching a class that was dedicated to the concept of neoliberalism was because students would see this word come up in the books that they were reading or the articles that they were reading, and they kept just telling me they just still don't understand it. And the more I would read the literature that came out, just unpacking the history and all of that, I said, yeah, we're going to really dig in. What I found, though, which is so interesting, is that by talking about neoliberalism from a cultural studies perspective, like it does, which roots it in people's everyday lives, which are very anxious. People feel very competitive with their peers, that they don't necessarily want to feel that way. They have a lot of personal kind of pain, and these are, kids that, some kids that we might write off as like, oh, you're privileged and you shouldn't worry about that. But in the space of the class, it was interesting to see how students could all kind of find their way into this, and like from a critical perspective, while also not necessarily saying everyone's the same under neoliberalism. We could start to talk about racial injustice and like gender injustices and those histories in ways that people didn't get defensive, because they were starting to see that neoliberalism was kind of like this, horrible thing that we're all kind of caught up in. And for the most part, I teach a lot of economics students who are like majors in economics and then take our more cultural studies classes as their minor. And even those students who tend to be a lot more conservative and pretty much taking neoclassical economics the majority of their career, it really resonates with them, and they kind of, think, we start talking about debt and what's happened on the financial markets, and, how that's connected to mass incarceration and all those kinds of things. And, they don't really, I guess what I'm trying to say is that students generally don't like the idea of having to think of themselves as human capital.
Right.
So.
Well, that's very subversive of you. I imagine that's going to get you in trouble at one point, but let's hope not. All right. Well, let's and I want to circle back on that, because one of the things I think too that from a cultural perspective is just social media and the way that there's a certain amount of sort of there's been some work on how that is training for the marketplace in some way. But before we get there, let's talk about the rise of neoliberalism, particularly in this country. And Mont Pelerin, of course, was a European summit, but where did we begin to see that change in the States?
So, I think we trace, and this is really important for, I think, people to understand. It's like, neoliberalism is kind of born out of, at Mount Pelerin, and out of people that are really concerned about the New Deal and what's happening in the wake of the Great Depression with the kind of rise of the social welfare state. But it doesn't really start to make it into kind of mainstream policy until the late 70s, early 80s, with the election of Ronald Reagan for sure. But that's because for years and years, kind of underground, like neoliberal thinkers and organizers were establishing think tanks and producing knowledge that was kind of built on their philosophies of the market. And so then when we have, the oil crises and political crises, people are looking for solutions. What are we going to do? And then here are these think tanks that say, oh, here's a radical, wonderful new way to fix the market. And so it was Reagan, I think, and then I would argue that, Clinton, pretty much all the presidents since Reagan have done a lot to forward a kind of neoliberal hegemony, where in the book what I want people to understand is that, we have a right spectrum and a left spectrum within our political discourse, but pretty much at this point both of those, whether you're on the right or left, are kind of contained by neoliberalism. So, and right now I think that Bernie Sanders' candidacy was probably the only kind of mainstream candidate to challenge that. Trump is confused. So
yes. Well, but let's. From a policy perspective, and aside from sort of, I guess, an economic ideology, like where did we start to see? Did it first emerge as public-private partnerships? Was it more when you see, was Taft-Hartley sort of, could that be considered a neoliberal piece of legislation in the sense that it inhibited the union's ability to strike in certain situations? Were there other larger federal policies that specifically started to track in that direction?
Yeah, so I mean, so to be clear, I'm a cultural studies scholar, but yes, my history on the policies is like the actual dates. But yes, Taft-Hartley. I think Reagan, like going after the labor unions, that was like one of the first big, that was one of the first moves, is to break the power of organized labor. I think
he
that
famously
also
had the air traffic controllers strike, and he essentially broke that union.
That was Reagan, yeah. And then, but also the kind of what's happening with the markets, and when moving away from the gold standard, all that, the rise of kind of the global financial markets at that kind of level, and then at the level where I think that I spend most of my time thinking about, just in terms of the kind of Clinton's dismantling of welfare, and the kind of three-strike rules. I mean, this is the state basically saying that if you're going to promote private market competition, and the state ceases to really care about its citizens, but to care about kind of global competition in a world market, then you have to kind of have these law and order policies that kind of lock up populations and police populations that are disposable and not necessarily desirable. They're not human capital, right? Those are people that can be relegated to social death. And so what do you do with them at that point? So I think Clinton basically creating policies that tell people, they have to go to work, giving tax breaks to companies to engage in these highly exploitative practices, which also poor people, which also help to break the power of unions as well. Like, I think that's a real crucial moment. And then, of course, you've got, NAFTA and all the free trade deals and all of that stuff that's happening around the same time as well.
What are the 4 Ds that you talk about in your book?
Well, so I kind of just was trying to, because this book is kind of big picture. I want them to kind of understand like how neoliberalism shapes our kind of social totality, if you will. And the 4 Ds are, I wanted to give students a way to really theorize what are the consequences, the critical consequences of living in a neoliberal world. And so the 4 Ds are meant to kind of capture those. And so the first one being dispossession, right, which is something that David Harvey talks about, accumulation by dispossession. But really what I want people to understand is the way that neoliberalism works to dispossess people, citizens, of basic rights, of money, of security, and all of that. And then, in a way, what Harvey's talking about is a very kind of economic dispossession that happens with divestment and kind of neoliberal policies. But dispossession we can also think about it as political and cultural processes as well. So I talk about the second D, I think, is disimagination, and that's what happens when we can only think about ourselves as human capital. We kind of find ourselves in a state of what the late Mark Fisher called capitalist realism, right? And we just have to think of ourselves as a brand, and it's about competition and growth. And we kind of lose the ability to think about a kind of broader social world that we live in, we share and live with other beings, human and non-human alike. The third D was, I think, de-democratization, which is something that Wendy Brown talks about in her book on neoliberalism, which I heard her on your show. And that's just the way that neoliberalism, as she says, hollows out kind of politics and democratic process, so that it turns democracy and politics into just a market. And this goes back to your point about social media. What it feels like to be political at this point is pretty much just sharing our opinions and news and talking on social media. And we really, because of neoliberalism, I think, shy away from actually getting involved in the hard work of collective governing, right, and governing our lives together, which is what democracy is rooted in. And then finally, I already mentioned the 4th D is disposability, and the way that neoliberalism has to draw lines between people that are able to appreciate themselves to be productive human capital in a global economy versus those who are disposable and can be relegated to social death and civic death.
I mean, let's talk a little bit about the interplay of these from a cultural standpoint. I mean, social media is the easiest. I would say there's two phenomena that I've noticed, particularly over the past, let's say 15, 20 years, that culturally, sort of, I guess, implicate particularly the disimagination and the de-democratization, and I guess also the dispossession. I mean, all four of the Ds. I mean, and that is, like social media, and then the sort of like the rise of of the how-to of how-to books. I mean, it seems to me that when I was younger in the 70s, all of the how-to stuff was about your emotional well-being, and finding your inner self. And maybe this is wrong. I have no data to support this, but it seems to me,
I think you're onto it. Yeah.
On the past 20 years, all the how-to stuff has been how to make yourself more efficient in achieving some goal that is either marketable or just make you more efficient so that you can compete better. And what are the other sort of phenomena, or is that, are those reflective of other phenomena that's happening culturally? What are the things that help do that? Or is it simply on some level just there's less money to go around, so everybody's trying to figure out how to make themselves more marketable and do it more efficiently?
I mean, I think it's it's everything that you said. I do think if I was going to hold up what are the two kind of quintessential cultural phenomenon that like help us understand neoliberalism and its kind of cultural power, and I would say the rise of self-help, and then also more recently kind of social media. But I think what you're getting at with the kind of self-actualization movement of the 70s was and then the transformation of self-help into these more like how to brand yourself, how to be more efficient, all those kinds of things. But neoliberalism pulled off this really neat trick where it kind of tapped into the counterculture, and as well as the civil rights movements of the 60s and 70s too, that were all critical of the welfare state and the way that it kind of squashed individualism in particular. And so in order to kind of be liberated, right, you needed to kind of really get in touch with yourself and not this kind of bureaucratic, oppressive state. And then, but what that does is it basically turns that, which all those movements, and there are some good things about that historical moment, but it really taps into that, but then basically puts it in the service of neoliberalism, creating a world where people have to take personal responsibility for your life. So there's no more safety nets. People have to kind of do everything on their own. They are supposed to live their lives as in competition with their fellow citizens and whatnot. And so how do you do that? That produces a lot of anxiety, a lot of insecurity. Well, then you have self-help kind of stepping in, and instead of being a force for like personal liberation and like you said, maybe getting in touch with yourself, like those kinds of things, it becomes a kind of way to control and govern the population as kind of they have to be these disconnected, alienated individuals solely focused on their own appreciation in the market.
It's interesting. I mean, that dynamic of in the I guess the late 60s and maybe the mid 60s and certainly I think in the 70s that ran sort of, I guess, concurrent with the civil rights movement, but was one part of the counterculture, the turn on, tune in, and drop out. I guess it was Timothy Leary, but that attitude of like sort of create your own reality and putting the individual outside of the collective. I mean, I guess that's part of that phenomena, right? Like where the idea was drop out of the conformity, but it turned into reject collectivism.
Right. Exactly. And I don't think that it necessarily, there was, history is totally contingent. I don't think things necessarily kind of had to go that way, but I think that because there was that kind of sensibility within the counterculture that was very strong and very seductive in a lot of ways that you could understand, and then to have the rise of neoliberalism kind of riding on the backs of those moments and these kind of cultural phenomenon. And you have, marketers, this is also around the time of the rise of lifestyle marketing and new psychographics and all that kind of stuff. So there's just like a whole convergence of forces, I think, at work.
So you have the these competing philosophies as there is a broad feeling of of individualism, and one is getting heavily financed too at that time, right? I mean, this is the early 70s is where you start to see a lot of money, I guess, sort of following the Powell memo, you started to see a lot of very wealthy people pouring money into groups like the Heritage Foundation and others that are sort of pushing these agendas. And now you also talk about the hustle, self-enterprise, and the neoliberal labor. This is, I guess, sort of more of this, 4-hour work week type of stuff.
Yeah, so basically the way the book is kind of mapped out is the first half is supposed to give you kind of a broad sense of the history and what is neoliberalism and like what are the kind of big consequences. We talked about the 4Ds and then I use the education system to kind of help people see how this all plays out. But then the second part, I really want people to see and understand the kind of way that neoliberalism kind of encompasses all dimensions of our life. So the chapter called The Hustle is about labor and how our working lives, we all have to work, we all have to figure out a way to get by. How does neoliberalism and this kind of idea that we have to be self-branding and personally responsible and appreciating our human capital all the time, how does that kind of play out in our working lives? And really what I want to do in that chapter is to help students and readers draw lines of connection between the kind of way that they feel that they have to be constantly doing different gigs or kind of hustling or working 24/7 or working on social media to brand themselves so they can network on LinkedIn or whatnot. People are kind of forced to hustle. They're disciplined and they have to hustle that way to kind of get by. There's this fear of failure, of slipping. But there are also ways that the state, it's not, you feel like a free agent, but the state is also forcing people to hustle too, whether it's through the kind of shifts in welfare, which force people into really crappy jobs, or whether it's the way that we have rethought, for example, how we finance higher education so that, young people who are in my classes have all this debt, and that means that they're going to have to take certain jobs instead of others or think about their lives in particular ways. And also thinking about the hustle in terms of gender and the way that we still, even though things have changed a lot, we still have this idea that, for the most part, women are naturalized caretakers and the family has to be this place, this kind of landing pad in this cruel world of neoliberalism, and the mothers are really hustling, and women are really hustling, when you don't have a strong public school system, when both parents are working all the time. So I was really, in that chapter, really trying to think about, okay, what happens to work in neoliberalism, and what are the connections between all these folks that might feel really divided along perhaps racial, gender lines, but we're all hustling. That was the kind of thread of it.
The student debt thing, I mean, is it seems to me is a great example of how the state contributes to this. I mean, the idea, aside from the shift over the years from providing if not free, a very low cost public option in most states across the country, or many states, I should say, through the 40s and the 50s and the 60s, versus now student debt being virtually the only debt, as far as I know, that is not dischargeable in a bankruptcy is pretty stunning. I mean, yeah. It doesn't matter how rock bottom you get, you're going to always owe that money for educating yourself. It really does for make it irrational for you to follow a career trajectory that is not going to allow you to pay off that debt.
Right.
I mean, if you have that option, which isn't necessarily there, and it's pretty stunning. And from an educational standpoint, and maybe we how else is it primarily through higher education, or do we see this in other aspects in terms of the state and education? Are charters a part of that?
Yeah, I mean, I think neoliberalism thinks that, and the neoliberal thinkers think that you're going to get a good and just society and like a kind of true entrepreneurial society by privatizing and marketizing everything. So that means schools too. So public education is, the idea that the state or collectively in communities or however you want to think about it, that this is something that we do together, like education, and we provide resources, and we, the idea is that like let's create a competition amongst schools, and that will, provide a better education, and the cream of the crop will rise to the top. Through that kind of system, as opposed to, again, a bureaucratic kind of top-down public education system. So yeah, I think, and again, we're fighting, battles over this. How do we preserve public education? Healthcare is another example too of the way that the state is kind of, involved in perpetuating neoliberalism in certain ways. But I think, again, that we're also still, especially in the realm of education, I think more and more people are growing, I don't know, like it's not acceptable to have this kind of standard-driven, benchmark, test-heavy system. We see more and more resistance there. And I think that that's a potentially kind of galvanizing issue. But again, the hard part is that, if you don't want your students in that public education system, then you put them in a charter or a private school, and then you're still contributing to neoliberalism in certain ways. So it's a really tricky, thorny issue. But
and talk about you have a chapter, the moods of enterprise, neoliberal affect, and the care of self. Is that more of the way that we imagine ourselves in the context of, I guess, what makes for the better self in this type of era?
Yeah, I was trying to think about what we talked a little bit about earlier, the rise of self-help, but how in a neoliberal world where you're human capital are you supposed to care for and kind of cultivate the self? And I want to address head on, because so many of my students struggle with mental health issues of anxiety, depression, and there's a lot of great research out there on the connection, and that more and more is growing, and the connection between the rise of neoliberalism and the rise of widespread anxiety and depression. So I wanted to kind of confront that, and then think about what are the two kind of, I guess you could say, trends within self-help, or what are the kind of ways we could think about what's going on there. And one of those is about the kind of financialization of the self that Randy Martin talked about in his book, The Financialization of Daily Life. And that's, again, how does that change the way we move through the world and the way we relate to other people and think about our bodies and think about our possibilities for being with other people or for social life when we have to think about ourselves in terms of finance, right? So I kind of try to give some examples about how that plays out through apps and wellness apps and whatnot. And then the other one is a term
Can
I
I just say that, it's because my daughter is, insisted on getting Sweatcoin, which pays her some type of faux cryptocurrency for exercise. That, are basically coupons she can buy I think clothing with or something. That is, it seems to me, sort of the perfect example of we're you're going to be you're going to generate a cryptocurrency if you're healthy, I guess, is the message there.
Exactly. That's perfect.
It's
Everything
super disturbing.
It's horrible.
And so what, and well, let's. I want to talk about the neoliberal citizenship and the privatization of politics too. Before, we talk about how you hope your students will react to this. I mean, because, and I guess this gets to disimagination. But before we get there, I mean, tell us about the privatization of politics and the what it means to be a neoliberal citizen.
Yeah, so I think in that chapter, and we've already touched on a lot of this, but just the way that, that neoliberalism kind of hollows out democracy. And I really like the way Wendy Brown talks about a kind of bare democracy, this idea that we can govern ourselves collectively together. That's the promise of democracy. And what happens within neoliberalism is kind of politics is totally privatized. So you get the important political actors are, philanthropists and donors, and you as an individual kind of, donor perhaps, or a consumer, if you think about things like Product Red or green, buying green products, all that kind of stuff. And so I think it's just the way that politics doesn't become about democracy anymore. It becomes about kind of expressing oneself through the market, right? And we see that both in terms of consumption and consumer culture and, celebrities endorsing causes, all that. And then we also see it, I think, too, as I mentioned earlier, on social media, where politics is about kind of getting yourself out there in an economy of visibility, so you're participating in this kind of circulation of content, which is constantly being capitalized and monetized and then fed back to you, So it's completely privatized. It's not about collective governance in any sense. It's about a kind of self-expression of your political beliefs in a kind of market that you are not actually, you might engage in conversation, but it's completely disconnected from that hard work of governing, a kind of population or a community, or thinking about how are we going to kind of get things done together on the ground. And so that's kind of what that chapter is about. Before
we get to that question about the students, I mean, I'm struck by. There's been a decent amount of reporting as of late, particularly in the wake of Donald Trump's, specifically in the wake of Donald Trump's victory, about the activization, if that's a word, activation of suburban, educated, somewhat older women who are at least engaging in organizing for electoral politics. We recently coming out of and I've mentioned this report a couple of times, but Theta Scopel and Lena Putnam reporting from research from Georgia and from Virginia and Pennsylvania, I should say, and. I mean, what do you make of that? Because this is a group who I would imagine, are these a group of people who are not necessarily imagining themselves, have not been raised in formative years with this sort of intense idea of marketing themselves in the way that, let's say, my 12-year-old daughter certainly is, and maybe even a 27 or 30-year-old is. I mean, is there what's going on there from your perspective, or is that, I mean, from a cultural standpoint?
So, I mean, it's hard to say, what's going on with specific people and communities, but I can talk about where I am, and I see a lot of connection. So it's funny when I'm writing the book, because a big part of it is that, I want people to see that, neoliberalism is not working, right? And people are really disaffected from it. They're, like I said, my students are sitting there, even though they've been pumped with this ideology their whole life, but they're like, oh my God, this is not the world that I want to live in, and thank you for helping me understand why I feel so terrible about my existence and how I can start to, think differently. I think that everywhere, people are sensing the cracks and the fact that this is not a kind of way to take care of each other. I think most people, I'm one of those people that believes that human beings, tend to be actually really concerned about, their neighbors and want to take care of people. And, neoliberalism has told this story that we all have to be competing and fearful of each other. But, I do think that there's something that people are starting to see, like, this is not okay. And as neoliberalism continues to kind of destabilize and rip apart the very foundations that make for community or make for social life or make for the possibility of being with other people who we need, I think you're going to see people start to step up in lots of different ways. So you'll see people running for office, right, and getting involved in electoral politics. Or you'll see what I see that's happening in our community in Northwestern Pennsylvania, but you've also see people organizing for new economic systems and basically saying Wall Street and like global economics, they don't care about this place, so how can we create a new economic system that's going to really take care of people? How can we kind of collectivize ownership of buildings that have been forgotten or in disrepair because, the jobs left and divestment and all of that. So I think that that we're in this moment potentially of transition where there's a lot of organizing happening at a lot of different layers. It's not the state is, the neoliberal state is incredibly powerful and strong, and you see that in the use of executive orders by presidents and all that. Like, again, it's hard to think about democracy in that formal way, seems hollowed out, but then when you're in communities and you're looking at what people are doing and how activated they are, it does. I'm not sure where it's all leading and where it's all going to go, but I do think that the resistance is growing, but we need to be able to draw lines of connection between whether you're working, in the Black Lives Matter movement, or whether you're working in the labor movement, or whether you're working, you're a group of women, working in electoral politics, or you're working on kind of solar issues in a community or food. We need to be able to see those as connected, which is kind of why I wrote the book, because unless we have a kind of common horizon that's not neoliberal, I don't know how we're going to kind of get out of this place.
All right, so let me just talk about the kids, because I wonder, and I should say students, what are we? And because I have a hard time sort of imagining, on some level, like what I would do if I was someone that age today. How do I, as an individual, create a situation where being a citizen, being a member of the community, being involved in multiple communities that is not organized by likes and assessment. I have a tough time imagining that for them, and frankly, I sit here and on a daily basis, the number of hits on YouTube or the downloads that I get, or are relevant to my well-being and my kids' well-being on some level.
Yeah.
Once they've read this, once they have sort of said, oh wow, yeah, I recognize this in my life, and it is a bit of a drag. Like, what's the next step?
So we talk about this a lot. In the book, I try to prompt them to think about little ways that you can, and just in the course of your everyday life, that you can start to kind of resist the stranglehold that neoliberalism has on your imagination. And that could be in the realm of friendships. Maybe, I'm a media scholar, so I'm kind of wary when people say, oh, the problem's all media, just get off social media. But thinking about what are your friendships like, and we read stuff and think about what might make for more deep friendships where you would start to trust other people again. Because, I feel very far away from my students when I talk to them about their relationships, whether they're romantic relationships or friend relationships. There's no sense of trust, and there's a lot of fear. And a lot of my best students, that are really critical and want to change the world, they're incredibly alienated from each other, right? So in these very little ways, how do you start to forge relationships of trust and whatnot? My college, I'm in the communication arts department. I also teach in community justice studies. We do a lot of community-based research and a lot of community-engaged work. And so getting students into the place in really meaningful ways where they're interacting with folks that are different from them, and kind of seeing the process by which like, how is the city going to kind of deal with the opioid crisis right now? Or, there's a huge amount of community organizing going on. And in one of my classes right now, we're having our students interview those people and create podcasts about the work that's happening in Meadville. And that stuff is incredibly transformative. And then thinking about leaving college, I mean, they wrestle with the problem, like, I'm going to have all this debt. I want to say, I want to resist and, whatever, but I can't do that. It's going to ruin my credit score. And we just talk a lot about, like, it's not you're never going to be free from it. I'm a professor, and, like, I have to worry about the same things you do about how many books am I, social media, we live in this world. But in other ways, too, I get to kind of be part of things that are happening here, part of the education, and helping us think, how can we kind of push beyond it. But I do think a student emailed me just 2 days ago and said, Julie, like, she graduated a couple years ago, she's like, I didn't understand what you kept saying about you just got to get involved in kind of your place in your community, in, like, the kind of local, again, that kind of feeling for democracy and working with people that you might not like that are different from you. She's like, I did that. Instead of being on social media, posting my kind of feminist post, and I'm so mad at the world, I got involved with my local library, and it's been hard and frustrating, and it's so much better than, like, spending my time on social media, right? But I think, there's, again, it goes back to there's just lots of layers of organizing that I think we all have to, Naomi Klein said in her book, This Changes Everything, it's all hands on deck. So I try not to say, oh, this is the right way to do it, or this is where you should be, but it's a kind of like, we've got to kind of everyone do what they can do from where they are.
Well, and lastly, what do you think that fear and lack of trust, where does that come from? I mean, what is it? Is it a function of the? Is that a function of the fact that, as opposed to when I grew up, I had far more ability to regulate what parts of me I would share with friends and what they could do with that. I mean, it just seems to me that, like, as I look at, youth today, they can't escape their past because it will live online forever. They can't regulate really in any meaningful way what they share with people through the means in which everybody shares stuff now, right? I mean, you could say I'm only going to okay certain friends, but the stuff is digital. Is that what makes everyone somewhat, distrustful or guarded, or what is that?
I think that social media kind of epitomizes and is kind of like a neoliberal machine, but I think I would say it's even more fundamental than that. So if you are kind of growing up in a world where every day and everywhere you look, and when you're in school, you're kind of interpolated or hailed as capital, as human capital, as this thing that has to constantly be growing, right? Then the possibility of failure is everywhere and terrifying. And
everybody's competition.
Exactly. Everyone is competition, so you can't trust them, you can't take those risks, and you have to be constantly focused on yourself. But I think that what that does, what social media brings to that, and that's a terrible way to move through the world, right, in terms of when you're thinking about organizing. But what social media does to that is I think create really kind of narcissistic subjects, and I don't mean narcissistic in the sense that they love themselves. I mean that it's so fragile because you can always if you're online, you can always be looking for that confirmation of growth, right? Or confirmation of your capital or appreciate. I got this many likes. I texted this person that I like and they texted me right back. So it's this constant, you're kind of conditioned by the technology to kind of crave and look for that constant self-appreciation, right? Or that constant growth or that constant validation. And so it just kind of takes the inherent anxiety of neoliberalism and this idea of human capital and technologizes it or operationalizes it in a way so that, people are just so constant in need of reinforcement and validation, but the kind of, I guess in psychology they talk about a self-concept is really fragile, and that's what narcissism is, where you just need other people to constantly confirm who you are, right? Because your own self is so fragile. And that's what I see happening a lot. And I think my students recognize it, which is a lot of them good, but then like you said, it's like our worlds are so mediated, at least, here, that it's hard. It's even if you see it happening, it's still hard to not participate in it, right?
Julie Wilson, the book is Neoliberalism. It's available through Routledge Press. Thank you so much for your time today. We'll, of course, put a link to it at majority.fm. Thanks again for your time.
Thank you so much. It was a pleasure.